and I've been working freelance for about 5 years now. This is a presentation that's sort of evolved and is about, as you can see, assessment of men who commit sex offences on the internet. I'm just going to start with a few random figures. The presentation, of course, will, as we go along, it will hone down at the end about what you do with the bloke in the room when he shows up. He gets referred through whichever referral route you're working with. But just to sort of look at the maybe the nature of the problem as a whole, because there's enormous numbers of figures. Some of these are up to date, some of these are not so up to date, but they make the point. CEOP, you'll know about this is a 2012 figure, because CEOP doesn't exist independently anymore, but they were getting these sorts of numbers way back in 2012 of reports of child sex exploitation online. There'd been a twofold increase on the previous year, and that's gone on and on since. Michael Cito, who is one of the doyens of the research in this field and will be getting quoted quite a bit. A lot of people, there was surveys of people there was problematic internet use, internet use, it says there, internet porn use. I'll come to the, not necessarily involving children. About 21% of people reported consuming child pornography. That's a report, and I'll talk about terminology in a minute or two. That was in Michael Cito's study, and people regarded partly as sexual, doing it for sexual interest, but partly sort of sensation seeking as well. This was not necessarily a typical population. Quite a few of Michael Cito's studies are in particular populations. I can't remember which population it was. There was a website. This is an interesting one. In 2009, the Australian Federal Police put a phony website up with 99 child sex abuse images, and it was up for 76 hours, and it had 12 million hits from 144,000 separate IP addresses from 170 different countries. So again, the scale of this thing is sort of illustrates. Stop It Now, this was a couple of years ago. It's probably no doubt gone up by now. They were getting in the region of 100,000 hits on their self-help line website. There's a film they've got online, and this again was 2 years ago, that had 9 million hits on this self-help film. Simon Bailey, who was the ACPO England and Wales police person at that time, was estimating that between 80,000 and 100,000 people were accessing child abuse images on a regular sort of basis. So this gives a sense of the enormity of the problem and the number of people who are viewing this stuff out there on a regular basis. What I'll do now is I'll begin to home down on what we do about the individual, but just to put it in sort of context. A word about terminology. Oops. Right, the screen's frozen. Here we go. Try this one. Right, a word about terminology, because there's lots of terminology flying around. The phrase I tend to use and prefer is child sex abuse images, but there's many of other terms as well. One of them is the phrase child sexual exploitation material. I tend not to use that one unless people are using it for active grooming of kids and so on. I think the child sexual exploitation definitions about, you know, children being traded and all of those sorts of things are we need to differentiate that from people who are viewing images. So we'll be careful what we're using. And the phrase child pornography is not a phrase that I approve of, and I'm presuming that the people on here probably don't approve of that either. It's difficult to avoid because if any of you are involved with ATSA, that's our big sister organisation over in America. They've got a listserv, and if they're talking about it on their listserv, everybody just calls it child pornography, and their research refers to child pornography, and some of their legal terminology even refers to child pornography. So if I use that phrase, it's not because I approve of it, but it's because I'm quoting somebody else. But the phrase I prefer, as I say, is child sexual exploitation, child sex abuse images. And just to be clear, you probably know this, most of you, but just in case, for the purposes of this type of offending, a child is anybody under 18. So if people are viewing images of somebody who's under 18, then that is, or possessing images of somebody who's under 18, then that's illegal in the UK. One of the big questions I think that we have is one of the big questions, and we might as well front this question up right at the beginning, is how many men who commit sexual offences via the internet have also committed offline offences, so offences involving a live, a contact offence. And this is made in a little bit of controversy, but the best sort of guess we've got at the moment relates to a meta-analysis that Michael Cito, and I think the et al. Is Carl Hansen, and they did a meta-analysis of various studies, and there's another one that I'll add in at the bottom as well. So we've got K21 studies there, and what they noted was that 12% on the record, 12% of the people who've been committing offences on the internet also had convictions for contact sex offences. Now, obviously, the official records are not going to tell us everything. So they also looked at studies where people had been either polygraphed or been in treatment, and where they had subsequently admitted to having previous contact offences. And that data, what people found there was that about 12% moved up to about 55% who were admitting offline offences. Now, I haven't read all of those 21 studies, I have to say. You'll be very disappointed to find out. But the 55% is not spread evenly across all the samples. So they were finding there were higher estimates in criminal justice samples and correctional facilities, which probably doesn't surprise people. So that 55% can't just be applied right across the board, but it gives you a bit of a indication as to what the proportion might be. There was a study came out after that. And then there were higher in clinically referred samples. So I'm guessing these are people who would go into. The problem with clinically referred samples, of course, is people are tending to refer themselves because they've got a problem, and it becomes a bit self-fulfilling. Just to highlight a study that came out after that, a fellow called Michael Burke and colleagues in the Journal of Sexual Aggression did a thing on tactical polygraphing, and they also came up with 55%. This was a bit of a strange study, and I wrote to Michael Cito and to Michael Burke about it, but never got an answer from either of them. It was actually polygraphing people who'd just been arrested. So I'm not entirely sure how they managed to get ethical approval for that. It also included, which opened up a bit of a debate for me, but I never got an answer to the debate. A bit of a debate about at what point people are solely internet offenders, because a lot of these people who'd been arrested were also, they were non-contact offenders, but they had been distributing images as well. So I wondered whether that had skewed the figures, but I didn't get a reply, so I can't help you on that one. There's a conundrum, of course, because the next question, if somebody's caught and convicted, what do they do subsequently? And again, the biggest studies are studies which have been developed, various studies by Michael Cito and Angela Eek, and they've developed a thing called the Child Pornography Risk Tool, which we'll look at in some detail later on. And what they were finding was that it says across the top there, it says across the top what the whether they were what they call child pornography offenders in the first column, general antisocial non-sex offenders in the middle column, and contact sex offenders in the right-hand column. And they were looking at what people might subsequently have been convicted for. And if you look down the left-hand column, they were finding that people who were convicted of child pornography offences only, in terms of subsequent contact offences, were being only 4 of them got subsequently convicted for a contact sex offence. That was 3% of their sample. There was the child pornography offences, so there was 7%, 10 of their sample. Any other re-offence at the bottom, 24%, and any other sex offence. So that might have included, that included their 7%, but might have included indecent exposure, or might have included other things. So there's a bit of a conundrum in that whilst these people, a significant number, we're not sure how many because they're not spread evenly across the samples, a significant number have had contact offences in the past. The number that get reconvicted, and I'm obviously, well, reconvicted or charged, there's been a Canadian study, is that 4%, 4 out of the sample and 3%. They've done a subsequent study, but unfortunately they didn't. They did a validation study of this in 2019, but unfortunately they didn't put a nice little chart in like this. So, but they weren't suggesting that reconviction rates were any higher. Where am I going now? So are we talking about a different type of offender here? Are we talking about somebody who's qualitatively different from other offenders? The people who are only who are non-contact offenders seem to be low risk, and we'll come to what all that means. But then, of course, the question is, are they low enough risk? And I guess if somebody's out, out in the community and things, they're not liable to be committing offences necessarily in the community. But would you let them go and live back at home? And I think in the abstract, I talked about different thresholds of risk. So the very much different thresholds of risk out in the maybe in the criminal justice system that I know a lot of you work in, than, for instance, if you're working in family contexts. And just to remind you all, these are sort of, don't forget the obvious. So we're going to be looking at probability as ever. This is what you do when you look at risk, I suppose. And we're going to be looking at consequences. Another way of looking at risk, I don't know if anybody has come across Gert Gigerenz's work. He talked about probability, but he also talked about natural frequencies. And natural frequencies are sometimes more helpful in understanding risk. I guess if you're working in children's services, you see, that there might be a low number, but you see the ones that get past you and the ones which do reoffend. One of the things that happened when they closed the SBU, of course, was I got drawn back into the probation service, and I was sitting on. I was called the safeguarding manager for the Northumbria Probation Service, and I ended up sitting on these, special serious case reviews and all these sorts of things. And of course, if you're looking at that end, what you're seeing is the few that come through. So even if you've got 3 or 4% coming through, that's not an insignificant number. Bearing in mind, of course, that's only talking about convictions. Some of the thinking in the England and Wales family court, for instance, when we're talking about risk, we talk about this is how the family court think about risk on the balance of probabilities. Something has happened. Some we'll talk about later on as well. Some stuff on the internet, of course. I'll talk about some case studies later on. Sometimes people do things on the internet that are concerning, but are not offences, which of course people do in real life as well. They might not get you through prosecuted, but they might get you referred to children's services because it's all a bit unsavoury or weird or potentially abusive. And because of that, a child is likely to suffer significant harm. And actually, the House of Lords pitch likely at a very low level. Okay, so they're talking about they're defined likely, and they define likely as a real possibility, a possibility that cannot sensibly be ignored, having regard for the nature and gravity of the feared harm in a particular case. So I suppose if you're sitting in a children's services office or you're sitting in a court or something, you're going to be saying, well, is a 3 or 4% a 3 or 4% likelihood of this sort of offending, of this sort of reconviction, the implications that has for actual reoffending, something that can be sensibly ignored given the feared harm in the case. So we'll leave you to ponder that, and we'll ponder it as we go. Anybody chipping in yet, Malcolm? Can everybody hear me, Malcolm? Yes. Hello.
I can hear you, Roger. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm assuming everybody can. Are we getting any questions in?
No, there are no messages for you urgently to have a look at. So I'll let you know. So just crack on.
We'll bash on, right? Okay. Again, just so you know, a lot of you will know this, but just so you know, when we're dealing with people who are looking at images on the internet, the police categorize, well, not the police, there's a legal categorization of these images. Category A is images involving penetrative sexual activity and or images involving activity with an animal or sadism. Category B is images involving non-penetrative sexual activity, and category C are other indecent images not falling within categories A or B. So that'll be posing and flaunting about and getting children to do things like that. If you're working in child protection, or if you're working in criminal justice, you might get them under the old. If they're historical offences, you might get them under the old Act. So I'll mention that just for now. This is called the Sentencing Advisory Panel, or Oliver Scale, and this was a 5-point scale. We don't need to go into it because it's a scale that will come up, but you need to be aware of it. And because if historical cases might be going on this level 1 to level 5 scale, and you might come across those. Sometimes this gets mentioned as the Copine scale, and it's not. The Copine scale was never used in prosecution or family work or anything like that. It was a research scale out of the Cork Institute, which had actually 13 13 different categories. But so if you see the Copine scale mentioned in any prosecution documents, it's not. That's wrong. It's the Sentencing Advisory Panel, and the Oliver was the case. It was Regina versus Oliver. On the scale, it's interesting. On the scale, if you look into Michael Cito and Angela Eek's work, you will. What they find is the severity of the images does not predict the probability of reoffending, which is something which people find sometimes difficult to get their head around. So particularly if you're in a family court, and everybody, people have been doing these really gruesome, looking at these really gruesome, even more gruesome images, and you're sort of sat in the middle saying, well, actually, that doesn't predict the probability of reoffending. It's almost like nobody believes you. Because, so you say, well, actually, that's what the evidence says. And people say, yeah, but I'm not putting all that sort of stuff. Other deviant content does not necessarily predict probability. There's a bit of a question mark over bestiality. I suppose there's quite a lot of question marks over bestiality. Nobody's really grasped this, but there are occasional sort of straws in the wind of studies that seem to think that bestiality is a fairly bad indicator. Of course, there's a question of whether it affects severity. So if somebody's been looking at really gruesome sadistic and images, whether they'll carry on doing that. But those are things which are quite challenging. Are we all right? One of the questions, I guess, is I'm just going to launch into sometimes why people are seemingly doing stuff on the internet, and not necessarily doing that out in the community. And this is a paper that I would recommend to people by a fellow called John Sula back in 2004, and he called it the online disinhibition effect. Okay, so he is suggesting that people do all sorts of things online that they don't do in real life. So he's talking about people who put like jihadi messages on the internet, and some of them are just daft teenagers who wouldn't dream of actually doing anything like that in real life. Sometimes you've seen kids coming out of court who've been trolling on the internet and threatening all sorts of harm to women and so on. And they just say, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not like that at all in real life. And people are saying, well, he's just a gentle, normal kid. What's all this about? You probably know, you might have done yourself actually, or you certainly know people who get themselves into trouble at work with email rounds and all this sort of stuff, saying things online in work discussions that you would never say to somebody's face. On our computers, everything sort of says, do you want to save this document, doesn't it? And do you really want to delete this document? I think there should be one which, if you actually do an email which has the word outraged or disgusted or appalled in it, there should be a thing at the bottom, an attachment. If it says, I've sent you an attachment, and it reminds you there's no attachment. But I think if you use these words like outraged and appalled and disgusted, a little thing should come up at the bottom saying, do you want to really send that email, or do you want to put it in your outbox and have another look at it in the morning? So we have all come unstuck with people flirt online, people say things on text that they might be a bit embarrassed about in the future, and all these sorts of things. This is a cartoon out of Private Eye, which sort of illustrates it. So this fella's walking down the street and shouts, "Hey, you bastard! I hope you die." And at the bottom, his wife says, "Can't you do that online like everybody else?" So this is a fella who's, as I say, come unstuck on the basis of this. What I do normally when I'm doing this in real life and not online, I usually open up a discussion about why this happens. I might just give this a go because I'm fed up of talking.
Roger, we can invite people to unmute themselves if they have questions at the moment.
Okay, well, let's give it.
As long as we take it in turns, I think it'll be fine.
Let's just give it a couple of minutes then, and unmute yourself and put a question in. Why would why do you think we are so disinhibited online?
Anonymous.
You're anonymous. That's excellent. Yes.
Feel safe?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that one.
Do you think people feel safe?
Yeah, people feel safe. They feel. We'll come on to that actually. Interestingly, in another study we're going to talk about in a minute about people feeling in a sort of little anonymous and safe and in a little bit of a bubble. I think people talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Feel curious.
Curious. In what sense?
It's something they've never seen before and they don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
And they just want to explore.
Well, I think in terms of the child abuse images, there's certainly a pattern of people going into things which are progressively more cause more different levels of risk and affect and so on. That's not to say they're not sexually aroused by this stuff as well, of course. Okay.
I think it allows people to justify their behaviour with a sense of detachment.
They've got a sense of detachment. Did you say?
Yeah, so it allows them to justify their behaviour because of that sense of detachment.
Yeah. I'm not. Sometimes when you're talking about attitudes and disinhibitors, sometimes they're active and sometimes they're passive, aren't they? So somebody actually makes an excuse, but then other times people are sort of like, as you say, there's a sense of detachment. It's not necessarily a definite excuse and a definite decision, but that sort of sense of detachment. I think we're tapping into a little bit of a theme here. Anything else?
David Orr says they think they're going to get away with it because they will not be found.
Well, what's actually quite interesting, we'll talk about anonymity as well, of course, is that you're lost in plain sight because of course, the only reason that people are not picked up on all this sort of stuff is there's that much of it. Every time you go on the internet, you put a mark on the internet, but there's billions of hits on billions of things every hour. So that's why people don't necessarily get found. But yes, people do think that there's a sense of anonymity that comes around.
Dara talks about peer approval within the online community.
Well, that certainly can happen, and we'll talk about that later on. That's a good question. That's a good point, Dara. And when we talk about what you were asking about and what you're looking into, then that's certainly something that's worth a look at. Okay, so we're getting to the point. Let's move on and see what John Sewler himself reckoned. What he reckoned is, yes, people do become unusually revealing, partly because of that anonymity, and partly because, all those, you don't have the, if you go further, you don't have that sort of feedback. You don't have the immediate as you're talking to somebody, you're getting verbal feedback, non-verbal feedback. People are looking at you. There's a case I might use later on as well of a bloke who it wasn't actually an offence. He got referred through Children's Services, not through the police, where he'd been online with a woman in America, and he'd been telling her that he was having fantasies about his daughter. And of course, it's not illegal to have fantasies about your daughter, but it's not the sort of thing you'd normally say to somebody in real life, you know, or any of these other things. You don't go into your boss and say, I'm appalled and outraged, and on no way am I ever going to cooperate with this stupid proposal. You'd sort of go, can we just have a bit of chat about this? And can we, you know, I think there's some real problems with it. You know, you get feedback, and it's not in real time. So any feedback that you do get is not real time feedback. It's in, you know, it's in another message sometime. It's not that immediate, you know, somebody's eyebrows go up, or, you know, somebody's jaw drops as you speak. People become more rude and threatening. This business about dissociate, I think you were tapping into, some of you, this issue of dissociative anonymity. That's a bit of a mouthful, but there's a couple of studies I'm going to talk about that I think were done with people from the clients that went to the Faithful Foundation, where they sum this up really nicely. And I think the other thing is people have an image of how other people look and sound, you know, so you might be communicating with somebody and you know, you're building up some sort of, maybe somebody's flirting and chatting and such, like they build up this image of how people look and sound. Or if you've been insulting, you might be having an image about how people, how horrible they are, and all those sorts of things. Just to illustrate, there was a couple of I don't know what's happened with this. These were a couple of studies in the 2017. There was a special issue of the Journal of Sexual Aggression back in 2017, and there's a couple of studies that I think, as I say, were done with some people from these Faithful Foundation groups that they run, and people in those groups were saying things are become normalised and meaningless. There's a lot of this business about people being feeling disembodied, feeling different. They manage to compartmentalise what's going on in online. Your online character would do things you would never dream of doing things offline. Dream of doing offline, and certainly never dare to do offline. This thing about a bubble is something I've come across. A lot of blokes say this, and it's all like independent, which is quite interesting that people come up with this concept. You're in your own bubble, or you're detached, you're devoid, you're in a virtual fantasy world. And blokes who just say, well, I'll lose track of morality. What we'll see later on is that most of the people who do this, the possession and stuff anyway, are generally well-educated, pro-social people. The last two I've done, one's a business, he's got his own business, about £1 million a year turnover business, and another bloke's was a headmaster and such like. So that, you know, we're talking about, this is the sort of demographic we're working with. One of the possible answers to this conundrum about people having alleged behaviours in the past and not necessarily moving on to that in the future is this notion. I'm just going to put this up. It's a bit of Kennington. It's not a approved typology necessarily. When we used to work at the sexual behaviour unit, we used to have like sort of 20-year-old psychology assistants and all that sort of stuff. So they knew everything about every new internet platform and every new thing. And so it's quite handy, you know, if you just ask them. If somebody came and they said, oh, I've been doing this on this particular platform, it was very easy to find out. I have to go and find out now because you know, I'm not necessarily familiar with all these things. But whatever platform people are on, they're on this sort of continuum, and they're on this continuum from sort of viewing and making images. Making images, people sometimes think means the kids in the room and they're taking the photographs and the videos and things like that. Making can generally just means downloading for most people. It's like if I photocopy a picture, I'm making that image, but the picture exists already. chatting and exchanging images, beginning to groom people online, and then contact offences. And this is a very rough, I mean, in real life, it's much more messy than this, but this is a very rough sort of continuum. From very much online and moving towards offline. And there tends to be a bit of an assumption that people are always moving in that direction. And this assumption is not actually right. And quite often, this was a point a long time ago when David Finkelhall first did that presentation at Dublin about contact offences in the community going down. He used a phrase that I wouldn't dream of using, and I'm not going to use it now. But only David Finkelhall would get away with it. But he was suggesting that some contact offenders were actually beginning to go online because they were feeling it was safer and they're less likely to get caught, and obviously deluding themselves that there was less harm. But actually, a lot of offenders, a lot of people who are offending are going the other way. And in fact, again, there's a study in the Journal of Sexual Aggression by this one in 2010, where 84% of the sample in this study were going from contact to non-contact offences. And there's a review, which I'm going to go, you'll get the full reference for later on. Henshaw et al. Were reporting, and in their clinical samples, they certainly had a lot of people who were going from contact to non-contact offences. So that might be one of the reasons. I need to get a move on here. What do people do in chat rooms? I'm going to whiz through this a bit. You will get these. You will get these slides, so you can go away and read them. A lot of people. There's always an assumption that people will put themselves online in a false identity. So a lot of people will be putting themselves online as 22-year-old bloke. He's a lead singer in a band or disco or a football coach or something like that. And that thinking that that's the sort of thing which would attract teenage girls maybe. But actually, quite a lot of them give the real details. So they put themselves on as 40-odd-year-old. I don't know whether they'll say balding with a pot belly, but they certainly put their ages on and all that. And I guess what's happening there is that they're beginning to tap into people who might engage with that, might be people who are a bit vulnerable already, a bit like happens in real life. Lots of inciting behaviours, some arranging meetings. Sex tends to get introduced very quickly. Highly sexualized discussions. 89% of people were mentioning sexual contact in their first meeting. Victims were generally 12 to 15-year-old. We don't know if that's because people are aroused to people who are 12 to 15-year-old, or whether kids under 12 are less likely to be on the internet and in chat rooms. So that's a bit of a question. 16% were using sexualized usernames. All weird, I remember Strap and Feather is one that comes to mind, and things like this, which are fairly obvious why that is. The mean discussion time is 9.5 days, a range from 1 to 74. Most were targeting girls. And there were explicit conversations about the children and the offenders in real behaviours. That again was in that was in an issue of that's the AXA journal. Mary Henshaw and her colleagues, again in this 2017 sex abuse thing, she went through all the typologies. I'm going to go whiz through these. What she said was all the typologies she could find, and they keep popping up all over the place, that these are qualitative, these typologies. Very few of them have been subject to empirical evaluation. There might be small convenience and bias samples. The point she makes, and the point I've made for years as well, I don't think it's original to me. I think it goes back to various philosophers, is actually, though, if you begin to classify things, the classification starts in the mind of the classifier and may not be relevant at all in terms of a useful assessment and risk. And I think that is true with some of these classifications. I'm not going to say which ones, because given how many of you are on here, some of you might be authors of, of some of these papers, or your mates might be authors of some of these papers. And I'm not going to. So we're talking about some of these. The demographics that were generally identified are mostly male, mostly Caucasian, mostly employed, and mostly well educated. But then again, this business about beware of moulding people into categories. We've got this one about the trader, the traveller, or the trader traveller. Joe Sullivan and Tony Beach there, collecting as part of a wider, possibly direct victimisation, collecting to feed emergent sexual interest and so on. We get quite a lot of this. I'm a collector when I meet people. They've obviously been on a certain, they've read a certain paper or been on a certain group somewhere, and also I let them talk a bit, and I say, yeah, but why are you collecting child abuse images and not pictures of Harley Davidson motorbikes or something like that? So that's a bit of a interest as to why people might collect that. Some people talk about situational offenders, preferential offenders, miscellaneous. That's quite useful, actually. Browser, private fantasy, trolling, a non-secure collector and a secure collector, somebody who's grooming, a physical abuser, a producer and a distributor. We'll talk about some of those differences later on. So there are all these different one-off categories. This one's had a bit of fair play. Hannah Murdian and her mates at Lincoln there, contact-driven, part of or to facilitate contact offending, fantasy-driven, fueling individual fantasies, driven by specific interest in children or part of wider deviant porn use, financial motives. Again, we've got the collectors, but why child abuse images? Again, we've got the preferential versus the sort of situational and opportunistic, and then the situational offenders. How did they get in those situations in the first place? So I'll leave you to decide, or go and read these up if you feel any of these take your fancy. These are some older ones, ages ago. This was a AAA engine that Cooper and I talked about way back in 2004, about being the accessibility, affordability, and anonymity. And I put there apparent anonymity. We talked about those earlier on. In fact, it's pretty much all free these days. I put there addictiveness as well. I think there's an addictiveness to the internet, which people have talked about quite a lot. This was Delmonico and Griffin, those of you who've heard them at NOTA conference, talking about people who might be predisposed to looking for this sort of stuff. People who start off recreationally, and then people who discover this stuff as they go along. There seems to be quite a pattern of blokes who start off looking at adult pornography, and then they start looking at some of these teen images that are around, which are either older teenagers or are older teenagers made to look. They're actually 18 or 19, but they're made to, dress up in schoolgirl uniforms and so on, to made to be look under age, and then through that they start then looking at more child abuse, more actively children, little children, and then there's lifelong compulsives. These might be people, as I say, who are going back on, who are going from contact offending with children onto the internet. So that's a bit of a round robin. What I want to do now is try and draw all that together and see how this compares with assessment of other types of men who sexually abuse. This is the first slide I ever animated, so it's a bit messy, but I've never had the time or the energy to unanimate it. But these are sort of strands of. If I was doing my usual thing on risk assessment, you'd get this slide at the beginning. So I'm going to look at static factors, and then the dynamic. These are the stable and acute factors. In the studies we've got, these tend to get like muddled in together. but that's roughly where I'm going with this. If people wonder what I'm talking about. So in terms of static factors then, you know, everybody probably knows these. So previous sex convictions and charges, general criminal convictions, age, no relationships, stranger victims, non-contact offences and male victims. And these are the two static instruments you're probably familiar with out there will be risk matrix if you're in England and Wales, static if you're in Scotland or Ireland. But what they found was that the static instruments were exaggerating the risk and probability of reoffending. And that was because stranger victims and non-contact offences were in there and were beginning to, by definition, confound the figures. So what they did was the static 99 people have said not to use static 99 for internet-only offenders. Obviously, if there's contact offenders who have an internet offence, then you just treat them as a contact offender who's got a stranger victim and a non-contact offence. But in terms of internet-only offenders, and Risk Matrix has an adapted version, which is a little bit controversial, but people still use it, which excludes those figures. And then the other one is a male victim. If what can happen, of course, is that people can end up with all sorts of things on their internet that they don't really necessarily been looking for or expect to be there. So if people are sharing files, for instance, you don't know what's going to be in that file, there might be boy images in there, and people just sort of look at them and pass them over, or even don't even look at them, but they're there. So if you've got if there's male victims on the list somewhere, there needs to be shown some sort of intentionality that they have been seeking out that. That's how the risk matrix people. That's how the risk matrix people interpret that. As I say, whether risk matrix is valid or not is if you're in the probation service and prison service and police service and you're told to use it, then use it. But it is a questionable as to how useful it is. But that's how they're interpreting that. The static people have said just don't use it. This is a thing called the child pornography, and again, this is Michael Cito and Angela Eek, and then they've done what's called a validation study in 2018. That's actually in the. You could probably get all these on. You can probably get all these online. What they did was they came up with this. They're working on it. It's quite small numbers still, but it's looking promising. It's not got the level of validity for use in a criminal court, probably. But I think it's an excellent guide if you're doing more qualitative assessments, say in family courts. And these are the items that they've come up with. So age at the time of the index offence, any prior criminal history, failures of conditional release, these look very familiar. Any contact sexual offending. This is a bit of a confounding variable, I think. We'll talk about that in a bit. More boy than girl content in child pornography. Oops. More boy than girl content in other child-related materials. So if people have other paraphernalia and child-based interests, and a sexual interest in prepubescent or pubescent children. This sexual interest thing is, how do you know? Obviously, if somebody tells you, yeah, it depends how good an interviewer you are. But if you can get them to admit it, then that counts. There's a thing called the correlates of admission of sexual interest in children that you can go and look up on the internet. And this includes never having been, in quotes, married. It says in the model, that means they've never been in an adult intimate relationship. Content includes a lot of videos, child sex, a lot of interesting stories, an interest that's been going on for more than a couple of years, volunteers with high child contact, community communication with children online. And if you score 3 or more on this, then they're saying you can begin to infer some sort of degree of interest in children. If you can use them, PPG or visual reaction time, they're not so common in this country, although some people use them. There's a scale that actually doesn't get much airplay in this country called the SSPI. Now, what the hell does that mean again? It's the short scale of paedophilic interest, I think that's called. If people want it, email me and I'll look out the actual name of it. And this was a thing that Michael Cito and his mates came up with in 2017. Again, it'll be in the journal. It'll be in the AXA journal. And these scores here correlate very well with PPG scores. So if you get quite a lot of these male victim, multiple victims, victim age under 12, extra familial victims, and in quotes child pornography, these are beginning to indicate significant degrees of sexual interest. You can look that up. That'll be on the internet somewhere. If you're stuck, let us know and I'll give you the reference. Again, in the research that led to the seaport, they were finding that if men were aroused by boys, they will tend towards those images, and so you will be finding a majority of images will be of males. And in the samples that Cito and Angela Eek were using, the men who were found to be aroused to boys, they were having about 75% of images there. So if you've just got these incidental images of boys, they're not necessarily an indicator of interest in males. And there's no research as to whether that logic applies to other material. So I've talked with Michael Cito about whether you could infer from that, for instance, if people start looking at intrafamilial abuse and all those sorts of things, whether we can apply. There's no research to say that. I'm not sure it's helpful on a training course. This is something there's no research on. Still okay? Have we got any questions, Malcolm?
No, Roger, I think everyone's...
okay, I hope they haven't gone to sleep. Yeah, that's right. So these are the recidivism rates. Again, you're looking at a small number at the bottom and not many recidivists. They're claiming an area under the curve of 70 to 74, which is similar to things like risk matrix and static and all those sorts of things. So the recidivism rates on the seaport are there on the right, estimated by, this is from the validation study, 0, 3%, 5 plus 40%. But if you've got what they're calling child pornography only offenders and they get higher scores, it only correlates with the probability of recidivism for more child pornography offences. It doesn't correlate to progression to contact offences unless you've got a contact offence. That's where it becomes a bit confounding and a bit circular. Look at dynamic stable factors now. There's lots of these papers around. There's a study there that's really useful if you haven't read it already. Our late lamented friend Ruth and Carl Hansen and David Thornton there. And there's a number of structured ways of looking at this. So again, if you're in Scotland and Ireland, you're probably using stable. If you're in England, you might be still using the structured assessment of risk and need. The structured risk assessment is similar. SVR20, RSVP, quite a lot of people use. And these are ways of looking at dynamic stable risk factors. And for most offenders, this is what you're looking at. So they're around, not going to go into detail, but they're around sexual interest, attitudes, social and emotional functioning, or relational style, or whatever the hell they call it these days, and self-management. Differences for internet offenders. Again, if you look at study Kelly Babchishin, I'm sort of always dreading that she gets invited to NOTA conference and I get asked to chair her session because I just failed to accurately pronounce her name. They did a 2014 meta-analysis as well, and then there's the Seaport studies, and then that Henshaw study as well that's looked at. So they're finding some of the issues about whether they're different. The samples are all very different. We're not quite sure how well contact offenders were screened out in the samples. We're not sure how the factors were measured necessarily. And of course, some behaviours, as I described earlier on, some behaviours on the internet, like the bloke telling this woman in California that he was having sexual fantasies about his daughter, are not actually illegal, but they might be worrying. So you wonder how they fit within the within there. There's very different definitions of what's a contact offence as well. I spoke with Angela Eek about what they do. They actually have to be going to meet somebody. Okay, so I think in this country we tend to be thinking, is somebody treated as if they're a contact offender if they start grooming and if they start if they start talking and if they start setting up meetings and all those sorts of things. But if so the issue of when you're a contact offender, you need to go and look into the study as to what it's talking about. So when is it internet only? That's the yeah. So what you've got is you've got differences between internet only offenders and contact offenders, and those who've got internet and contact offences. And there's some differences, but they don't predict progression. So you can talk about that in your assessment, but you can't be, and you can probably begin to say, well, is it a real risk it's not sensible to ignore, because they're all very qualitative, these things. But if you're being really hard-nosed about this, the differences don't predict progression. So in terms of sexual interest, this is one that you'd be interested in. And paedophilia, you know about. Hebephilia, again, if you're not familiar with the American literature, you might not know about it too much. Hebephilia is a sort of a persistent interest in pubescent children. So what we find with internet offenders is that there's a high sexual interest in pedo and hebephilia. Follow this one. The Dunkelfeld people, this is a bit of a weird sample because, of course, it's people who are volunteering to go to a project and tell people that they've got a problem, but their people were mostly hebephilic, so they were sort of settling around interest in 12 to 13-year-olds. What you need to know is the mixed offenders. So if you've got people who have internet offences and contact offences, they are the most paedophilic or hebephilic. They are the most deviant in terms of sexual interest. The internet-only people are more paedophilic stroke hebephilic than contact-only people. Okay, so that's worth knowing. So if they deny it, it's worth pressing on that. Obviously, not all of them. This is research into groups, like any research into groups, and you can't assume that the research into the group necessarily applies to the bloke who's sitting in front of you. But it does mean that your questioning might be a little bit more determined.
Roger,
yeah.
There's a couple of questions about weighting of risks and how you weight risk in order to try to get a measure on the likely progression from internet to contact offences. And also, Victoria's asking about any pointers in relation to risk assessing men who committed sexual offences whilst a juvenile, but then none in adulthood, and sentenced in adult court.
Well, the first one is that what I'm presenting is the research as it is at the moment, and it's the predictors are not particularly definitive. So you've got numbers that get reconvicted, like any offending, whether it's sex offending or not offending. There will be a figure behind that, which are people who commit offences but don't get convicted. So you need to be guided by this, and you need to be guided by situations, and you need to be guided by protection plans, and you need to be guided. I'll come on to the maybe come back on that one. As far as juveniles are concerned, I think there's a whole there's probably a whole different. I mean, I've had conversations with particularly the likes of Stuart Allardyce, who might be interested to get him to come and do one on adolescents. I think it's the same as if. I mean, I get quite a lot of these. I get quite a lot of people who. Well, yes, I do actually. I get little flurries of blokes in their 20s who, seem to be settled down, seem to have gotten in a relationship and wanting to have children and so on. And I guess the question always, the way I approach that is, what was driving, what was motivating and maintaining the offending at the time, and are those factors now still managed? I mean, that's sort of what we do, whether it's a contact offence or a non-contact offence, and if it's around impulsivity and people sending sexting in the playground, and if it's about, I mean, because teenagers might possess this stuff, but it's not sexually deviant at all. Because you might actually have a teenager who's 17 having sex with his girlfriend, takes an indecent photograph of her. It's legal to have sex with her, but it's not legal to have the photograph. So you need to. I mean, you need to look what was going on in his life then, and himself then, and now, which is how I guess I would approach most of these things. I hope those are okay answers. Sometimes a high degree of sexual preoccupation, and we've come across quite a few people where this is actually distressingly intrusive, and they're almost, we were tending to, when we had the SBU, we were able to just send them off to Don and his colleagues, and they'd be really welcoming things like SSRIs and things to try and medication to try and calm that down. Attitudes, fewer generalised supportive attitudes. This is probably because they're kidding themselves, because they're generally respectable in quotes. Fewer generalised, probably because they're kidding themselves. There's no victims and such like, but more things about their own victims, more distortions about their own victim. They were only this, they were only that. It was only a level 1 image. It was only they were only posing and that sort of thing. And mixed offenders had more empathy deficits, so more sort of antisocial attitudes. Don't know why that's happening. Relational style. Some of the studies found differences in increased emotional loneliness. That won't surprise you. Decreased emotional congruence with people. Interestingly, some of them, again, not all. Not all of these, but there were significant minorities in some studies where people were getting very detached and almost like schizoid. And we're actually, this doesn't explain why they were looking at kids, of course, but we're actually detached and not really very engaged in relationships with anybody. So their life is sort of like lived in their heads and so on. Okay. And then self-management, generally lower impulsivity, lower self-regulation issues. But there was a study, the NSPCC, CEOP, and the NHS put a study together, quite a significant risk of self-harm on arrest. So how different are they? So the differences in dynamic risk factors are patchy, except where there we go. Increased sexual interest, and be aware that mixed offenders are most deviant, and factors associated with antisociality, such as other convictions, generalised empathy deficits, and so on. They were more different with the contact offenders and some socio-affective and relational deficits in some studies. I guess what we're looking at really, to some extent, is the motivation and facilitation models, or motivation and disinhibition models. There's a couple of models on the go. I've got halfway through trying to write an article about this. Anna's on here, I know, and we'll be interested to know this. David Finklaw, of course, came up with this. Michael Cito came up with this motivation and facilitation model and was presenting it at Dublin without any reference to the fact that it was very, very similar to David Finklaw's original model, although he brings in some other things. So what we seem to be finding is, in terms of these models, is that there's a high degree of motivation. So there's a high degree of sexual interest in children, sometimes a high sex drive, which again is a thing that Michael Cito taps into. And then the question is, you know, many of these people seem to have that interest, but seem to be well managed. So they don't have these facilitating and factors and overcoming internal inhibiting factors such as attitudes, antisociality, and poor self-regulation. So I think that's possibly where we're going. It seems a long time to be going back to good old David Finklaw's work back in 1984, but that seems to be giving a little new lease of life with that seems to be given a new lease of life.
Roger, we've got a couple of questions coming through that I don't want to miss out. Orla in particular is asking for any pointers about legal implications as a therapist if clients who are not convicted suggest or insinuate that they have progressed into illegal image.
Okay. Well, we have in therapy. Part of my at the beginning, I would have and certainly in the groups, I remember we would have a big board up with informed consent, and if one of the informed consent was like if we knew there were immediate risk issues, or if we knew there were offences where there were identified victims, then that would report it to the relevant authorities, and that applies whether you're in internet offenders or not. I guess it depends what they tell you, and you have to work that out in your own sort of situation. If somebody says, well, if somebody said, well, you know, I sexually abused my stepdaughter when I was living in Gateshead in 1963, but no, not 1963, 1993 or something, then you would have an identified victim who'd report that. If somebody said, well, I met a kid outside of a toilet in London in 1972.
But Roger, the difference between the moral imperative and the legal imperative.
Well, I think the moral imperative,
depends on the jurisdiction as well, doesn't it?
Well, you have to look at your own agency structures and your own professional structures and so on. There's always, again, it's not. There's always a tension in therapy about whether how far you let people. You know, people need to know at the beginning that if they tell you stuff, it might go outside the therapy room. In the jurisdictions we're dealing with it. That's not the same if you're ringing in from America.
Roger, I saw a crack through a couple more.
I do need to move on, but go on.
Yeah, I know you've only got that quarter now left, but Elizabeth says that anecdotally they're finding more men on the autistic spectrum, which is interesting, of course. And Simon talks.
Well, the autistic, the autistic spectrum, that's not necessarily surprising if we're talking about people who are, I mean, I'm not saying autistic, you know, I'm not going to get into autism's the same as schizoid, but that whole area of I'm just going to turn your sound up a minute, right? That whole area of where people are living their lives in the head, if you know what I mean, is not entirely surprising. What's the next one?
I'm sorry, the other thing was asking about any research on psychological approaches to reducing sexual preoccupations.
Well, I think we're moving into treatment a bit here. If you come on the...
There are some, of course.
Yeah, I mean, what you do in treatment, I mean, is it the same? There's, you're approaching it often as an addiction. You might be, talking people down. You might be using diaries. You might be, you're probably wanting to know what is it which is driving that sort of preoccupation. You'd want to know how intense it is, because actually some people, it's just like weaning them off other addictive behaviours and so on. So we can talk about that maybe if we get more into treatment. Can I move on?
Yeah, please. I'm just mindful you go about...
Yeah, okay. I need to move on because I got some discussion.
Yeah.
Oh, bloody hell. Keep jamming up for some reason. Right, so what sorts of things then would we be asking somebody? So what just again, if people want to chip in, what sorts of things would you be wanting to know about if you're interviewing somebody or reading the papers? This is going to overrun a little bit. Any questions? Any suggestions? What you're going to do when you're sitting there with somebody? What you're going to need to know? And I have to say, it's not always possible to know because the police don't always report things like the number of images compared with other things and all that. So a lot of this is quite difficult to find out. Or shall I tell you? 5, 4, going. We'll move on. And these are not in any particular order. If you look at the search terms that people are using, that's can be quite important. Start looking as to whether they've been on the dark web or not. The dark web tends to get you into areas. It's been a bit overstated, the dark web, but it's still not a place you want people going. Really, it's where people buy something like guns and drugs and stuff like that. If you see references to Tor software on any of the paperwork, that means they've been going into the dark web. That's the software you put on your computer to get into the dark web. Sometimes you can see specific interests. So things like PTHC means preteen hardcore. So if somebody's searching PTHC, they're searching preteens. Otherwise, they wouldn't be putting that in. And you'd need to know how they knew about that. How does somebody know, if they haven't been on a course like this, how does somebody know that what preteen hardcore actually is about? And that gives the lie to anybody who's sort of saying, "Oh, I just stumbled upon it," and all this sort of stuff, which a lot of people might start telling you. Apparently irrelevant terms. So sometimes people, if you start this, it wasn't Budapest. I can't remember what it was, but it was some European capital city. And I said, "What's all this about?" Budapest. What? Why? How do you know? And of course, if somebody's typing in Budapest to look at child abuse images, that's coded, and it's obviously they've been in touch with a paedophile group or something like that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a clue. I mean, I wouldn't know. Or Budapest, as that sort of says. Certainly, if it's Budapest, that definitely is a coded thing. But any of these sort of apparently irrelevant terms, and people say, "I just stumbled upon it because I typed in Budapest." That's not often not the case. Content view, what are they looking at? And particularly what you'd be looking at is whether people are developing an interest in particular types of children, and particularly males, or is there a big incest type interest or something like that? Other online activities, so are they using chat rooms to normalise the behaviour? Are they talking with other offenders who've got sort of similar attitude to they, and they're all talking about, you know, having it off with the nieces and having it off with, you know, that might be an indication as to whether people are actually actively thinking about specific children. You can sometimes find out, if you can get hold of the chat logs, it's really quite important to drill down on all this stuff. Sometimes it holds up your assessment, and I'll have Barney's about holding up the assessments because I haven't got the information. But then you read the chat logs, and they're talking, as I said, they're talking about specific kids, or they're talking with other offenders about such like, or they might even be soliciting in extremis. They might be beginning to get involved in sort of solicitation. How often they're accessing this? Is it something that they, you know, finish the day's work and then just go on for an hour? Or is it something that they do and then there's a big stop in what they do? Yeah, I mean, like the headmaster I was talking about would have his computer up in his office in the house. But then when he was on holiday, he didn't. So he didn't have a problem. When he went on holiday, he just didn't look at it. You know, he didn't have to take his laptop off to the beach or something like that. So in terms of how is the person able to inhibit their behaviour in the future, then, you know, how often and in what way they're accessing it is quite important to know. How recent was the access? Occasionally I've come across, sometimes, I don't know if anybody was involved in that thing where there was a Canadian website that had been running years ago, and this bloke had been on this Canadian website years ago, and he'd been ordering DVDs. That shows how long ago it was, getting all these DVDs posted and such like, and was looking at stuff then. But he hadn't looked at stuff for years. You know, he just came up, it was completely historical, and he hadn't looked at anything for years. So obviously you'd want to take that into account in your assessment. Are there risk taking? You know, where is it in the house? Are there other people in the house? You know, is the computer in the front room and such like, or is it locked away? That might be interesting. You know, if you're talking about risk in terms of somebody living in the family, what would be the risk there of maybe he wouldn't commit a contact sex offence, but what about the kids seeing, you know, the kids seeing inappropriate behaviour and all those sorts of things? So there's some of the questions you might be asking. How do they represent themselves online? Some don't. I always think this is mildly amusing because I think they're probably, people who are online represent themselves in certain ways. And I get this impression sometimes of, you know, a police sergeant in a suit in Bristol talking to a police sergeant in a suit in Newcastle, both pretending that the kids are online. But generally, how do they present themselves online is interesting, and what they thought they were going to be gaining by that. Are they masturbating in real time in the chat rooms? Are they masturbating to images when they're looking at it? They probably are, but when they're in chat rooms and so on, are they masturbating about the person that they imagine that they're talking to and so on? How immediate is all this arousal and interest? Are they withdrawing from everybody else? Are they using this as a, you know, they've been withdrawing from the family? Are they withdrawing from, again, this fella, I don't know why all these things keep coming up, but he was having to, he was so obsessed with this stuff, he was then having to get Viagra so he could have sex with his wife, which was all a bit bizarre. But are they, you know, they're withdrawing, are they beginning to use this to feed their own emotional needs as well as sexual needs and so on? Can we see a progression? Are they beginning to get more and more, you know, the needing, in quotes, to go and look at more extreme activity and so on? Again, that doesn't predict that they would move on to contact activity, but you might be beginning to worry about that. And it might be something that would be making you less reluctant for them to be going home and that sort of thing. Not that you might send them home. How much time are you spending online? How do they separate from family images? So do they separate from, you know, have they got indecent images in among beach images of their own kids in files and all those sorts of things? That's something which is sometimes highly dubious. Are they acting out the fantasies in real life? So are they getting the partners to do things that they're looking at in on the internet? Those sorts of questions that you might be asking. If you were doing partners work, for instance, you might be wanting to ask the partner, you know, does he do anything weird? Is he straightforward? Is he getting you to, you know, do the sorts of things that you probably ask about anyway? We should be. Are they sharing images? One of the things about these, I always say to people, colleagues or friends or anything like that, if you're on file sharing sites, get off them. Obviously, you can get yourself into all sorts of trouble on file sharing sites through copyright and all them sort of things, but you actually don't know for sure what's in the file. And a lot of people are getting, this is one of the reasons the numbers of images don't necessarily tally, because you can just get thousands of images that you're not necessarily looking for. So people don't, what you need to know is what they're looking at and what they're viewing and what they're going back to, not necessarily what they've got in their files and so on. I remember one bloke, there was a teacher that Gail and I assessed years and years ago, and he'd had a victim, and then he kept a photograph of this one victim, and he was sort of masturbating to this photograph, this one victim for many days a week. He might be more risky than somebody who's got like just this big pile of rubbish, a load of stuff which they were never looked at. So you need to try and drill down with them what they're actually looking at, and how near are they to the production of the images, the actual, how near are they to the guy who's in the room with his camera and his video and his mates telling this kid what to do and such like. How much of the time of the day are they online? I think that's a bit of a repeat. It's a bit like other addictions. How did they, is it disrupting other activity like you would with anybody with can they not get to work? Can they not do this? Can they not do that? The other thing's interesting is how did they get caught? Now this is a bit frustrating because of course the police don't let on, and sometimes even the police will not, so that you might get something where somebody's initially charged with downloading, making images, but they're also charged with distributing images, and then all of a sudden the distribution goes off and the police don't pursue it because they don't want to give away their operational details. So this is highly frustrating, and it's highly frustrating when you talk to the bloke because of course often they don't know either how they got caught. So if you can find out how they got caught, that might be interesting, because it might be that the police are going into a particular website. It might be that he's been in a conversation with another offender, and they might or might not share that. But it's always worth asking that.
Roger, I'm mindful that some people will need to be moving on soon. So
yeah, I'm going to
key points.
I'm winding up now. Last last slides. I'm winding up. I'll be about 3 minutes.
Okay.
So numbers of images, I've talked about this already quite a lot. You need to know what numbers they've got compared with other material that they've got there. I'll just do a quick case study about a bloke who didn't let go home. 45-year-old bloke. He'd been downloading images. He had a previous caution for domestic violence, hitting his wife. His wife had chucked him out because of this, and he was seeking. He had a 2-bedroom flat, and he was in this 2-bedroom flat, and he was asking for stay in contact with his 2 daughters who were aged 11 and 13, and he was a bit aloof and resentful, but he was too bright to be actively hostile. You know, like these sort of like surly. Well, I'll cooperate with the assessment. And the assessment was very much a sort of intrusion. And part of the thing one of the questions was, so what do you think the victims felt about your behaviours was one question. And of course, what usually happens with these people is because they're all sort of fairly pro-social and they've got these attitudes of kidding themselves that they're not doing any harm. But you can usually, you say, well, they'll say, well, there weren't really any victims, because I was just doing this online. And you can sort of say, well, what about the kids in the pictures then? And they'll say, oh, yeah, I suppose if you put it that way. And you can soon begin to, with most of them, sort of engage. This fella didn't. He said he got really, really arsey, and he started pointing at my my writing pad. And when I gave him the supplementary question, he said, look, there were no victims. They were just on the screen. You'd better be careful what you're writing down. So that didn't go down terribly well with me. I then said, bearing in mind your daughters would be in your flat and they might be in bed, they might be bathing, etc. What would they be to stop you abusing them? And he said, well, it would be about resisting temptation, obviously. I quite like the obviously at the end there. So we were beginning to begin, me and Sheila, I think it was, who were doing this one, we were beginning to be increasingly, what should we say, increasingly concerned about this fella. And then he, I had this thing, I had this sort of like guided fantasy. So I was saying, well, imagine, we're on a cruise ship and it crashes and we're all on a desert island and we have no laws. And we've decided that people are sort of like, you shouldn't murder each other and you shouldn't steal from each other. We've done all that. And we're working on agreeing the actual age of consent. So where do you think the age of consent would be set? If we were doing that from scratch, like, and he said, well, at the age of biological maturity, we might have had it obviously on there as well. And I said, what, at 12 or 13? And he said, probably yes. At which point I closed my file and his face dropped because he realised what he'd said. And I said, thank you. So thank you. And that's a little roundup for today. And that's me. If you want to get in touch about any things, any...
Roger, thank you. First of all, from Notice to say thank you very much. And I know some people will have to go, but I also wanted to make an opportunity for anyone who had any particular questions I wanted to raise now.
I'm okay. Yeah, I'm okay. I'm not.
For people who do want to go, I just want everyone to be clear that we will be sending out some written material, or at least some internet material from the training this morning. But questions for Roger, please.
If anybody, I'm okay for time.
Hi Roger, it's Vanessa Coleman, and it's probably a big question for now, but I've just got a question about gender reassignment, offenders who want to gender reassign. I guess it's a big question for now, so it might be something for later. So it was just about... Well,
I tell you what, I don't know how that affects specifically the internet,
no.
but you, the person who is... I don't know if you noticed the introductory course that we did a month or so ago, myself and Jenny Hay.
I missed it, yeah.
Yeah, Jenny Hay is actually doing a PhD on this at the moment. And so we'll be getting, because what you're doing is you're beginning to try and